are here at KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, and we have with us Ben again from Mesosphere.
Right.
Ben, what are you doing at KubeCon?
What are we doing at KubeCon? Well, we're sponsors of the event. I think we've been sponsors for every KubeCon so far. Yeah, we always have a big presence here. We're on the CNCF governing board, so we tend to have the governing board meetings right before Cloud Native Con. That's always great. And then I'm also on the CNCF TOC. And this year we took Kubernetes generally available on top of our product, our platform, DCOS. And so it's exciting to be both meeting a bunch of our customers here as well as talking to new people about how they can run Kubernetes on top of DCOS.
Yeah, so you tell us about, bringing Kubernetes to, tell us why did you do that?
And it's interesting. I think a lot of people, they sort of ask that same question, especially because I think the media did a great job of...
No fake news here. No filling New York Times.
Well, we did a great job of really kind of creating this sort of container orchestration wars, which was, Mesos versus Kubernetes versus Docker Swarm versus even Cloud Foundry versus all sorts of these things.
Right.
And it wasn't exactly accurate because Mesos was always designed to be this lower level substrate upon which many different kinds of orchestration systems might run on top. And so, we'd built many in the Mesos community in the past, and I think at the peak, there was probably 5 different orchestrators that you could run on top of Mesos. There was, Marathon. There was one from Twitter called Aurora, which a bunch of other people used. One from Groupon called Singularity. Netflix actually just a couple weeks ago open sourced theirs that runs on top of Mesos. So anyway, lots of orchestrators. And so we always wanted to be able to bring more orchestrators if we wanted to in the future. And so really actually bringing something like Kubernetes to our platform, which is DCOS, which is powered under the covers by Mesos, made a lot of sense because the point of running these things on top of our platform is to make it easy to install them, so kind of day zero operations, to install and deploy them, and then to make it easy to ultimately to upgrade them, day 2 operations, eventually to make it easy to run multiple of them. So a big thing that we have, which is killer, is we'll run multiple HDFS clusters or multiple Kafka or Cassandra clusters in the same on the same set of resources, and we'll manage all the day 2 operations of that and everything else. And so we wanted to do the same thing for Kubernetes. We wanted to bring that, and we chatted with some people and they say, yeah, well, we're just running 1 Kubernetes cluster, is that fine? And then other people will be like, well, we're running 5 or 10 Kubernetes clusters. Well, how are you managing those 10 Kubernetes clusters? Like, oh, well, we're using scripts or Chef or Puppet, and so we say, well, we'd love to help you out with that. And so that's one of the main reasons why we brought it to our platform. And it's going great, and we just GA'd that on the platform on the product in March, and so we're here talking about it.
Right. So what kind of customer is it going to help?
So think about central IT, organizations that are thinking about being able to provide Kubernetes as a service to the rest of their organization.
Okay.
So they want a place where their folks can come up, and just like if you went to the public cloud, you could click a button and you could get a Kubernetes cluster. They want people to come up to their system, DCOS, click a button and get a Kubernetes cluster. Except now, they want that flexibility across all the clouds, as well as in their on-prem data centers or in any edge data centers or anywhere else. And so, our product literally is Kubernetes as a service on DCOS. And that's the way you can think of almost all the things that we run on top of DCOS is really this as a service model.
Right.
Is everything that we try to run is, all the things that we bring onto the platform, we try to give you the as a service experience for that thing. Kubernetes is no different. So, your central IT, you're trying to run a bunch of Kubernetes for each of your users. You want to give them potentially dynamic abilities to bring up, elastically scale those Kubernetes clusters. You could do it with, say, OpenStack or another private cloud for on-prem. Obviously, you can do it in the public clouds because it's already there, it's already built. But how would you do it in a way where you could do it the same way across the public clouds as well as on-prem? And yeah, so that's what we end up providing.
Since you are here and you are meeting a lot of customers, you are meeting a lot of community members, you're meeting a lot of partners, what are the what are pain points that you feel are there within the Kubernetes user? You already mentioned one
running multiple clusters. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the obvious pain points that's becoming more obvious, obvious, that we even kind of heard about today during one of the keynotes, is there's this really interesting thing where we had VMs and then we had PaaS. And PaaS didn't sit great for a lot of people. And even infrastructure as a service didn't sit great for a lot of people. I'm one of those people, right? When I first built Mesos, infrastructure as a service was like giving me a VM. I don't want a VM. What do I want to do with a VM? I want to take some resources and then run some stuff inside of a container. So that was sort of what we started with Mesos. And then PaaS was like, for a lot of people, it's way too opinionated. It's way too high level. It forces people to do things in particular ways. And so then we ended up getting, container orchestration somewhere in between, the low-level VM stuff, the Mesos stuff, and then the PaaS. But the reason why PaaS was a thing was because it was trying to simplify the deployment of your, your applications. And I think one of the pain points that people are starting to see is even the deployments on Kubernetes, there's lots of things that are easier.
Right.
But all of a sudden, because now things will get rescheduled dynamically on stuff, but all of a sudden I have not one, but maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 YAMLs, and the YAMLs themselves are getting quite complicated. You saw talks here like deployment, no YAML deployment, and in the keynote this morning, we saw trying to simplify the deployments even further to just basically be able to do Git pushes. I think that's a pain point, and I think that it'll be interesting to see if people push even harder into the PaaS land, and if they try to push Kubernetes into the PaaS land, or if they build PaaS-like things on top of Kubernetes, or what will actually happen there. But yeah, I see that as a pain point that people are really trying to think about, and it's interesting because then we got serverless and functions as a service, right? And that's like even past PaaS. That's like, okay, even deploying whole applications is too hard. Let's just go ahead and deploy functions. Let's simplify it even more. We'll just deploy functions. And so what will be interesting is as people are adopting Kubernetes and they're running containers, if some people, as they're like, wow, this still is like a lot of work. Like we get all these wins, but we want to simplify it even farther. If they'll just kind of leapfrog and go directly to functions as a service. Anyway, so that's some of the interesting stuff that I'm seeing. That's one thing. I think storage is still a challenge in the container ecosystem, and it's interesting because I think that we're, in some ways people are like, well, let's not solve the storage problem. Let's just interface and consume existing cloud-native storage solutions, S3. So forth and so on. And that works great in cloud environments. But then when you're not in the cloud environment or you're on an edge environment and you still want to do storage, then you start to ask the question, well, what's the best thing to do? And again, if I could plug DCOS for a sec, that's one of the main things we've been trying to focus on is running the storage services on DCOS because there are a lot of really hard, challenging problems to do. And we care about not just being on the cloud, but also being in any environments. So that's again, it's another challenge that I see, and we've been trying to address that and help with that, at least in the community, the broader container orchestration community. We helped to create a interface called the Container Storage Interface, CSI, and there's been some great talks here and a bunch of great progress there. But it's just one step of many for what ultimately we'll need to do to bring some of the more sophisticated storage workloads to platforms like Kubernetes.
So as the whole market, you mentioned PaaS, and the way, and then you mentioned function as a service or serverless. uh, first of all, is serverless a silver bullet, or can you run everything as function as service, or is it makes sense only some cases which are really event driven, like uploading a picture, where you need to tag and do some things come up and it's done and it goes back, or IoT devices, when a spike in temperature leads to something else. Is it like ultimate? It's like just like we saw the evolution of from one machine to VMs,
Right.
So is it same, or do you think it will evolve, or it's like just few use cases?
I mean, it's a great question. It's funny too. I love the name serverless because when functions came out, AWS Lambda at first, I was thinking, oh, that's a cool name. And then when we took on the term serverless, I remember sort of being to myself like, wait, but isn't that what we're doing with containers?
Right.
We're trying to have you abstract from the server, whether it's a physical or a virtual server. Function seems like it's even farther in. But anyway, but will functions as a will Lambda serverless, will it be a panacea? I don't know. Will it do everything? I think it's a good question. I think probably what's going to need to happen for it to do everything is programming models are going to have to change.
Okay.
I think right now it's great for people that are trying to do like dealing with events, event streams, some of this one-off stuff. I think the programming models really have to change for
okay.
And what I mean by that is we're so used, and like programming models and architectural models, like we're so used right now to be able to build some system made up of a bunch of components that are all going to really be calling into each other. Like that's really the way we think about building our applications. And serverless turns it on its head a little bit because it's like, it's just going to be this function you're going to call into. And then naturally people are like, okay, well, but to call this function, I want to abstract and do a bunch of these other things. And so people kind of naturally start to build a whole bunch, like build a pretty sophisticated serverless app that has this single entry point. But I still think that we're going to just have to think differently about the apps that we're building. Like, I don't know, maybe the next serverless, like maybe instead of going to jump all the way to functions as a service, maybe what we'll jump to is even more like APIs as a service, where what you'll build a system where you're installing more of the APIs. And
when you look at serverless, there is a FAS and there is a BAS, a backend as a service, right? So what role does API play in that space? Because FAS is totally different, than BAS.
Yeah, I think it'll be much more like the backend as a service. It will be sort of the next iteration, and functions as a service will continue to be more focused on just events and those things. And maybe eventually they'll completely converge, and then we'll build everything that way.
Right.
And it'll be interesting too, because then, the question on everyone's mind at a conference like Cloud Native Con, KubeCon is, do we need VMs anymore? And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not the question on everyone's mind at the future Cloud Native Con, Functions as a Service Con, would be like, do we need containers anymore?
Right.
This industry moves fast.
It is, and it's things. I mean, we are talking about serverless now or function as a service. We don't even know, as you said, by the next KubeCon next year, we won't even know what new jargons or what new term, what new paradigms will pop up. And the beauty is, I was talking to Heather before you, and was that because all of this work is happening in open source. So all the brightest people, people like you are, they're like suddenly they are in the same room.
Yeah.
That would never happen in the traditional proprietary world, where engineers just sit in their room, and so it's like the mess that you have to deal with is so much innovation is happening.
I know.
You cannot even keep up with that.
I know. Well, it's funny, right? When a lot of people ask me why I care about open source, to me it's because open source it's ongoing science. It's the ongoing science experiment of computer science. Like that's the science part. Open source is what draws it, right? Like when you think about two scientists at two different universities, one scientist is working on some experiment, and then they write up the scientific method. What were the things they needed to do this experiment? What was every step that they needed to do?
Right.
And then what was the outcome? What was the independent variable they tweaked? And they do that so a scientist at another university can actually do that. They can try to replicate the science experiment and, and show, and then they're able to slightly tweak it and be like, well, what if we did this other slight different thing, and that's innovation in the science world, right?
Yes, that's how it works.
And that's basically what we're doing in open source too. If we didn't have open source, and somebody built something like, say, container orchestration, and you wanted somebody else to be able to make that next innovation, it'd be so much harder because they couldn't see what was the scientific method,
So are you saying that proprietary software is more like alchemy? It is actually kind of,
It's kind of more like alchemy.
Yeah.
I'd like that analogy.
Yeah.
Now, the tough part is that what ends up funding, at the end of the day, most of the open source work that we do is the enterprise side of it.
Right.
Right? And so that's kind of it's almost like, in some ways, a dirty little secret is, yes, open source is really critical, but if open source companies can't be successful, then they can't pay to continue to invest in the open source. And so it's this little bit of a cyclic loop that we still have to work out.
But I think that's also kind of, if you look at any other organization, the ecosystem, if the ecosystem itself is not sustainable, it will just perish,
Right,
so that's what the same here also. Just because you guys are not doing things for the sake of technologies, it's also building businesses,
right.
And that is
feeding
it back.
Right.
So it's like cycle of life. I would look at it positively,
Yeah, I mean, so it's a positive thing, but I think the part that sometimes slightly gets lost is new open source technologies come out of, I'll call them the big tech players.
Right, that's true.
All the time.
Yeah.
And fundamentally what that means is that the last big piece of technology that came out of one of those companies is probably not being used or run by that company anymore.
Right.
Google's a prime example of this.
Yes.
Right? They built one storage system, Bigtable, and then they found a better way of doing it, and so then they built Spanner, right? And then eventually maybe Bigtable still has its uses, but eventually maybe they'll stop using it and they'll start using just this other thing.
Right.
Cassandra is another great example. Came out of Facebook. Eventually Facebook iterated and built a different thing. So what keeps those open source projects alive for the broader ecosystem tends to be the startups that start around the Cassandras.
Yeah, true. Yes.
And those are the ones that have to be successful to keep that tech really going.
Yes.
And so that's where you end up getting this sort of chicken and egg thing, is like if all they're doing is just putting open source stuff out there, they can't be as sustainable as a business, which means they can't funnel resources back into the open source project.
Right.
And so sometimes you have projects that have enough of a broad community that it works, and sometimes you don't. So anyway.
Yeah, the best thing is that we are living in a phase where so much is happening. So life is exciting, it's fun. And it's more fun being a tech journalist in this field than being an iPhone, writing about iPhone.
Yeah, well, because it's all alchemy for you.
In
the iPhone, it's like...
And there is no innovation happening. It's just like repackaging or just tiny. So it's exciting, because here is real tech. You saw CERN yesterday. They're doing amazing. You're talking about 10 and 20 clusters. Look at what they're doing there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yep.
Anyways, it was nice talking to you today, and hopefully we'll see you at the next event, some next open source event, and
Perfect.
we'll
Thanks for having me.
continue this discussion.
Cool.
Thank you.
Awesome.